Today, usually we are hosting architects and urban designers on Thursdays, but today is something else. We are hosting David Green from Perkins and Will. David will present himself later, but I will give a brief information that David has worked on many projects dealt with sustainability, urban design and urban strategy, and today he will present you a brief presentation based on constitutional ecology. So I'm leaving the word to him.
Great, thanks very much. So if I start to speak too quickly, tell me, because I do that even for English speakers, so I may be speaking too quickly. But anyway, I'm going to take you through a fairly simple presentation tonight that has to do with the relationship between the natural world and the law, right, and the way we build cities. But before I do that, I'm going to start with a quick story. And in this story, I live in London, and I'm walking home from work one day, and I've done something to annoy my wife, which is very typical. And so I decided I'm going to stop into a florist and buy her some roses, which are her favorites, right? And when I get inside, I find that I have two choices. I can buy roses that were grown in the Netherlands, right? Or roses that were grown in Kenya. And because I've been told that things that are grown local are better for the ecology, for the environment, and because I'm the kind of person that wants to do good in the world, I decide to buy the roses that were grown in the Netherlands because they're only 220 miles away, as opposed to the roses that are grown in Kenya that are 4,200 miles away, and even worse, they're flown in on a jet, which is the least sustainable way of moving things around the world. But when I get home, I start to think that something's not quite right. Am I really making the right decision, right? I've been told all my life to buy local. But I do some investigation, and I look at the way the roses are grown in Holland, and I look at the way the roses are grown in Kenya. And even accepting the fact that you're flying these roses in 4,200 miles, it turns out that the roses that are grown in the Netherlands produce 6 times the carbon. They have 6 times the carbon footprint of the roses that are grown in Kenya. So even though I think I'm doing good in the world, it turns out that I'm getting further from my desired goal. And so this is the basis for the way we think about cities, right? That we can say we want to do things, but we have to be able to measure these things to understand that we're actually getting closer to our goals. And much of the regulations and laws that are put in place actually get us further from the things that we want. And so in order to do this, the first thing we have to ask ourselves as urban designers and planners and as members of the city is, what kind of city do we want? Because without this, we have no way of knowing if we're getting closer to that thing. And so I showed this slide, and I've been showing the same slide for about 20 years now, and I ask people every lecture, right? Would you rather live, and I want you to raise your hand, this is not a joke, would you rather live here? Who wants to live here? Right? Some of you, who wants to live here? Somebody's thinking about it back there. But I've only had 3 people in those 2 decades say they want this, and they were all transportation engineers, right? But the point is that most of the decisions we make as we plan cities get us much closer to this. Just look at Istanbul. We're making decisions that get us more of this, but everybody in the city, except the traffic engineers, want that. Why do we do that? Why do we constantly make decisions? Well, in this situation, as we're designing cities, we have to keep a couple of things in mind, right? We're building for unknown futures. And so whatever we do, we have to create a kind of framework for development, regeneration, redevelopment, whatever it is. And it's impossible to predict this. And so we have to know that everyone has different opinions. We all know this. Anybody that's been through a public process. And that it is absolutely impossible to predict what the market will do. So as I started thinking through all this, because I liked words, I came up with this idea of constitutional, right, which is the making of something. So we constitute cities, right? We build them, we make them, and it's also authorized by a constitution, a thing that drives the legal framework within which we develop. And so it's making something and creating the legal framework to see it put in place. But it's also to found, right? Like we found a city, like the Romans used to drive a stake at the Axis Mundi and found a city. And to legally process, we take a set of plans down to the municipality and it legally gets processed into a project. And then there's the idea of ecology, which is a fascinating word, right? And it's really more about a pattern of relations, right? We think about it now as something different, but it has to do with the underlying relationship between things. And it comes from, oddly enough, the Greek words for the study of inhabitation, the way we live. So ecology is not primarily about leaves and trees, at least historically, right? That meaning didn't come into existence until the 1960s, right? It's really about understanding the way that we live. And so we have the sort of notion of human ecology, which is the way we organize the spaces within which we live, right? And so I made this up. This is my definition. I didn't get this out of the dictionary, but it's really the patterns by which we inhabit the earth and the law that regulates these patterns. I up until about a year ago, taught for about 20 years, and I constantly told my colleagues and my students that while we were learning and teaching design, 99% of what dictated the way the world emerges is the law, right, that's driving all of this. It's not just our desire, it's the sort of legal process. And then the second is the act of making right decisions for our grandchildren and polar bears. So keep that second one in mind for the last two slides. And so in all of this, there's one fundamental relationship in every city that's ever been planned or designed, right? And it's the relationship between public and private. And it's something that has become very difficult for us in the last 100 years. But we can look at Miletus, which is not too far from here, which was the first planned city in the history of the world, right? It is actually nothing more than the projection of what is public, right? Those streets that we all hold collectively that bind us together. I don't think that has a thing. Some public buildings, and then everything that's private, everything that's commercial or domestic is not described. You simply have the blocks within which these would occur. We see this in the formation of historic Roman towns. Again, it's a very simple framework that's describing the things that we hold collectively, streets, right? And those areas that we can develop within that framework. This is Philadelphia, the plan by William Penn, and it's interesting because it's not just a simple sort of grid. It actually has hierarchy. It actually has spatial differentiation. It has characteristics of roads that are different. But what's fascinating about this, and this is from the original plan, and you can see that it was originally agricultural parcels and then very small freehold parcels. But there's something in this structure that over time has allowed Philadelphia to turn from something that was solely agricultural, right? And this stuff, that right there, is owned by that person, that person, that person, that person, and that person. And it was present from the very beginning. It wasn't something that was done on a project-by-project basis. And ultimately, it turns into something like this, which is a very rich city. And you start to see things like parks and gardens and redesigned streets emerge within this framework. But the absolute best example of this from a conceptual structure is the city of New York. And so in 1807, the mayor of New York commissioned 3 men, right? 1807, so they were men. 3 men to design everything north of Houston and 14th Street. Now, their primary goal was economic and efficient, right? But in this process, what they did was lay out a framework that would drive development, a kind of sustainable development for the next 200 years. And it's a fascinating history because, does that work? Nope. Oh, God. That was the wrong button to push. Sorry. I'm very bad with technology. Let's see. Oh, look, it got right back to the right one. And so, in this situation, everything north of the blue line was farmland and villages, right? So how does somebody 200 years ago come up with a plan that's going to accommodate the Empire State Building, right? The world's largest building for 4 decades, to accommodate Times Square? Well, they had no way of knowing, but there was something that was intrinsic in this. And in fact, they thought that it would be centuries today before that island would be completely developed. They had no way of knowing that it would happen as quickly as it did. And in fact, all the streets were, and parcels were developed by about the last part of the 1870s, so it was much faster. And so that then turns into this, right? Now in this situation, there's a kind of logic, right? Because the intersection of 32nd and Lexington in 1865 could carry a farmhouse and a couple of row houses, right? But in 2011, that same street, that same public area that carried infrastructure and all the things we hold collectively allowed for the construction of these incredible high-rises. The framing of the city didn't change over time. It's absolutely the most sustainable possible way of developing cities. It's also the most accommodating and flexible, right? I think. And so it's a very simple set of diagrams. You have a framework that exists outside of the individual piece, right? So once I set this thing up, I can have circles or triangles, and they have a relationship to each other, right? Not because of their similarity or difference, but because of their relationship to a third thing, right? To this prior structure, and it's expanded, right? So I can expand the way that it moves across the world. And it works for buildings. And the buildings don't just expand, but they can also change. Change with the market, change with time, change with the way people live. But the one thing that never changes is this framework that's public that we, again, all hold collectively. And so this is a big issue perceptually for us today, because what happens is we see large parcels, and this is from a project that we were working on in Atlanta. And so people look at this, and it's a quarter of a mile long or half a mile long. And when we ask what it wants to be, people say a Whole Foods or an organic supermarket or a mixed-use office building. But what they fail to realize is the dimensional character of this, right? So this is really 10 New York City blocks. So imagine that you were asking someone if you wanted to put a Whole Foods or a mixed-use project on everything between 5th and 6th Avenue in New York from 42nd Street to 52nd Street. They would think you're insane. But we do that constantly, right? We're constantly unaware of the dimension of the things that we build. And so embedded in this idea, right, in all planning, I would argue, is that how we divide up our land is more important than what we do with it. But no planning in the world right now is based on dimensional capacity. It's all based on use. It's based on land use. It's based on density calculations. It's based on something that in every city that was planned up until the 1920s came after the physical dimensions were put in place. And so we can look at a number of different projects, a number of different cities throughout the world and understand, and this to me is kind of fascinating, but this is, I don't know, 70 meters by 200 meters, right? It's a pretty small block, wouldn't you say? That block, 60% of that block housed the world's largest building, as I said, for 4 decades. The Empire State Building is from there to there, right? And so people always tell me they can't get buildings on small parcels, small blocks, but the biggest buildings in the world are on small parcels and small blocks, right? So it's a matter of understanding how those dimensions work. But embedded in all of this, of course, is the law. And so the law ultimately is based on obligation, right? Obligation to make sure that we're not harming others. And so in the United States, most of the regulations that we see come from a very simple occurrence in the last part of the 19th century that had to do with tenement housing, right? And so we find ourselves in Lower East Side in New York, where you've got people living in absolute squalor. I mean, it's a life and death situation. It's not about do we get more green space or do we have access to a grocery store. It's we're going to die, right? And so the obligation to keep people alive is the foundation for the original regulations for the way that we design cities. And so if you ever think you have it bad here, or anybody in the world thinks they have it bad, the densities in the Lower East Side at the turn of the century were small parcels, a 2-acre parcel, right? That small parcel I showed you before had 2,200 people living on it in 7-story walk-up tenements with no bathrooms, right? No air, no light, no nothing. It's unbelievable. So we forget that where this stuff came from was a matter of life and death. And so we see, just for example, the progression of the Knickerbocker House and the way that the laws actually changed and drove the form of building. They drive the form of the city more than anything any of us will ever do in our lives. Maybe, right? Maybe for Rick, we'll do more, but it's not going to come from me, right? And so we have this amazing transformation, because if light and air and open space is good, that means more light and air and open space is better. And so this old city is unhealthy, and this new city is much healthier. Of course, we all know what this is, right? It's Le Corbusier and the Plan Voisin, right? And it's the idea that you have towers in the landscape and sheep grazing in grass. And how can you possibly look at this and not think that you're healthier, right? Of course it is, right? And so then we see this move into the idea of actual regulations. And so this is the first zoning ordinance, right? The thing that drives the design of cities in most areas, which is an odd thing, by the way. And so in the United States, it was all because of this one building, again in Lower Manhattan. And it was driven by the fact that this building cast a 7-acre shadow at certain parts of the year, so it was a problem for its neighbors. It was causing health problems, and it was causing market problems. And so what happened was the idea that you regulate these things. So you tell people where they can and can't build. No longer do you have absolute freedom to just do what you want to do. And this was an effort to bring light and air into the streets, and to not be, and this is the fundamental legal issue in zoning, to not be a nuisance to your neighbor, to not cause harm to the person that's next to you. Right? This is why we can't put the slaughterhouse next to the single-family house. But about 10 years after that, something happened at the federal government level in the United States, which was fascinating. And it was the creation of two models. One was for planning and one was for zoning. And so the second one in 1928 was the City Planning Enabling Act. And it was a very short, simple document. And all it did was tell cities how they would set up a planning strategy, right? And what was embedded in this was a very, very simple idea that you would put in place a comprehensive plan, which had a very different meaning than it does today. And it was first and foremost and almost exclusively about the laying out of new streets. So everything that had been done up until that point in time was about laying out new streets to facilitate the development of cities. Now, over the next 200 years, what we see in not just the United States but everywhere is a rash of all of these different kinds of regulations. Now, the challenge with this is not just that the thing that was most important, the street, without which New York, Pennsylvania, most great cities, in Philadelphia, most great cities in the world would never exist. It's that this thing, in every single jurisdiction in the United States and in most jurisdictions throughout the world, no longer exists in the planning process. So that thing that we use to design cities, from Miletus to Savannah to Philadelphia, not only is submerged in the regulations, it's made illegal, right? It's taken out of the planning process. And so then there's this other thing that we call zoning that everybody's very aware of, and this is from the 1916 ordinance in New York, and it broke. So think about how embedded this is in the way we think now. It's embedded in the way that we distribute uses throughout a city. And so we have residence districts, business districts, and unrestricted or industrial districts. And to us today, that seems like an incredibly common sense thing to do, right? But in fact, it was a very, very new idea just 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago. But what's doubly fascinating about this is that the 1916 zoning ordinance that the city of New York was tied to a street plan, which meant that every single use in the city was tied to the physical dimensional plan that was the projection of the city itself. It wasn't big yellow blobs that said residential, big purple blobs that said mixed use, and big red blobs that said retail or industrial, right? It was tied to a very sort of physical part of the city, which is the way cities have worked, again, not just for hundreds of years, but for millennia. And so, oddly enough, because of a strange situation with a legal case that was in front of the Supreme Court, the Zoning Enabling Act got adopted before the Planning Enabling Act. And so what this meant was that the perception among the burgeoning planning community was that land use, the use of the thing that changes the most easily, this used to be a cinema, right? It's no longer a cinema, it's TAK. I mean, it didn't change any of the streets out there. It didn't change any of the fundamental structure of the city in any way whatsoever, because the city could accommodate that change. That idea that this use is more important than that thing out there that we all hold collectively was turned on its head. And it's the single thing that drove the development that we have in the United States and many other countries to get away from the idea of this permanent structure, this permanent collective structure, and the temporary use-based system. And so, again, this is the pullout from the Zoning Enabling Act, and it talks about size of buildings, location of buildings, structures, land for trade, industry, residents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It talks about how they fit on the site. It's all the stuff that we think is most important, that I would argue is the least important aspect of building cities, right? And it's hard for us as designers to understand that, because we think of this thing as the most important thing, when in fact it's just a temporary element of the city. So, we have a kind of diagram. This is the way cities used to work. You had all these different kinds of things that were together, and you had all these different kinds of ways of getting around the city. But as you move through time, you see from 1926, November 22nd, right? You move the industrial and the sort of airport and other things outside of all of this stuff, because it's actually not compatible. It can kill you, right? But then we go further, right? And we take the houses, because protecting neighborhoods was the basis of zoning in the United States, right? Protecting the idea of the single-family residential neighborhood, and we move those out. So all that stuff is taken out of this once vibrant city, right? And then we further break it down, because we've got places where rich people live, middle-income people live, and architects live, right? And so we then, right, get rid of every other way of moving around the city. And of course, you haven't done that here, but this is what we live with, right? So that just disappears. So everybody has to get these stupid things, right? And then they expand exponentially. That is a problem you absolutely have. And then the only way to get to all these different places that are now dispersed, and you definitely have that here, right, is through car. And so it's so obvious, it's unbelievable when you look at it like this. The process that we've gone through, we continue to buy the roses that were grown in the Netherlands, thinking we're doing the right thing. Let's widen the highway so we can increase the capacity, right? And then what happens? Well, of course, you have ups and downs in the market, and so then some of the houses start to become unlivable. You know, you start to get areas of the city that start to fall into disrepair, and there's really no way to replace those, because you can't come in the suburban neighborhood and change that house to a gas station or change that house to a restaurant because of zoning, right? Because it's protecting it. So all of this leads us to the problems that we have, and of course it's all based on this if you haven't ever read this, you should, but it's the single case that made zoning, land use, constitutional, the law of the land, and it had to do with protecting single-family residences. So imagine this. You're talking to people in 1926 and you're telling them, wouldn't it be great if we protected single-family residential areas from all these bad things? Nobody's going to say no, right? They would be crazy. But there was an incredible unintended consequence that came from that decision. And so this is a strange thing, but this is from the Supreme Court legal case. And so what the justice who wrote the decision said was that it's just a matter of a pig in a parlor. It's the wrong thing in the wrong place. And with that decision, we then started relocating all of the different uses in cities to different zoned areas. I guarantee you that nobody sitting in this room can imagine a city that doesn't have zoning, right? It's impossible. Ezra's over here shaking her head. It's impossible to understand it because it's so embedded, but it's only existed, and it's only existed, you know, as a general tool for about 80 years. And it all comes from this, right? So think about this. We've lived in settlements for 6,000 to 8,000 years. This piece of property in the city of Euclid, Ohio, was next to a single-family residential neighborhood. So in order to protect this, they took an industrial parcel and they changed the land use. So it went from low density office to medium density to high intensity industrial, right? And so what you see for the first time, I think, in the history of the world, right, is the use of something being totally dissociated from the street, right? Think about that. So streets are the thing that we all hold collectively, the public framework, is no longer important. And I go back to the 1916 zoning ordinance, right? And everything up until that point in time was tied back to this public structure. But it's not just about the idea of the thing. There's also a dimensional capacity, because we have to tell people how wide these are, how big they are, how big blocks are. And so we look at something like the city of New York. And so the story is, I'm standing here at 32nd and Lexington, and a friend of mine calls me for coffee. Who here's been in New York? Just curious. 1, 2, 3. That's not bad. 4. But you can imagine exactly what I'm saying. So you're standing at 32nd and Lexington, and somebody calls you at 42nd and Lexington and says, come up and have a cup of coffee, right? And it's 10 blocks. It's a half a mile, right? Which is a pretty long way, but you immediately say, I'll be right up there, because it's such a nice walk. And the reason it's a nice walk is because you're walking in front of very small blocks, and so things are constantly changing. So psychologically, you're perceiving that you're moving much more quickly, right? So you're more apt to walk through these situations. But if I'm at 32nd and Lexington, and he's on 8th Avenue and calls me, it's 4 blocks crosstown, right? Which are much longer blocks, and anybody that's been there knows it's much more difficult perceptually to walk crosstown, right? And so you can look at this and you can start to say that the physical dimensions of these things cause you to do less walking. Now, so, I mean, this is New York. There are millions of people that live here. It's not that big a deal. And, you know, walking crosstown 4 blocks isn't something people are not going to do. They're not going to get in their car and do it. And so this is a sort of diagram of the way that would work. But what happens when, because of the laws, that's translated into something, and this is exactly the kind of thing that y'all are starting to see, right? Big super blocks, where that entire 10-block area is the face of a shopping mall with residential on top of it. You know the building typology I'm talking about, right? And so you would have to put a gun in somebody's head to make them walk that distance, whereas in New York or here, in this neighborhood, right, you would gladly walk that distance. If you're walking down the Market Street or you're walking to the ferry, you think nothing of it. But you would never walk through that space. But all of this, the parking requirements, the setbacks, the development controls, were all driven by law, right? It wasn't driven by design, as much as people want to think that. The person that did this was restricted by the requirements of buffers, et cetera, of open space. And so there are things that are required that cause problems. And so people wonder why the world looks the way it does. This is in our hometown. And this is not because somebody thought it was a good idea to put acres of parking in front of a building, right? It's because we have this thing called open space. So who thinks open space is a good thing in cities? I don't know. I'm going to tell you in a second. So this is what we think of when we think of open space, which is beautiful, kind of bucolic, great sort of natural space. But in fact, it comes from this idea to make buildings objects, right? To create something that somehow is creating health and safety because of the distancing of these things. So this is from the 1961 zoning ordinance in New York, which was actually the foundation for every zoning ordinance in the country. And what it did was broke up, it made what's right outside this door absolutely illegal, right? And it gave you bonus. If you pulled the building back from the street and created a plaza, it gave you bonus and gave you more FAR. Now, this is so embedded in the psyche of people that live in these areas, right, that it's taken 40 years to get people to reevaluate this. And this is the power that the law has, right? And this is why it's so important to understand how this works. And then, of course, there's this crazy calculation that does what? It gives it credibility. It makes it look scientific, right? And so in this case, you're taking something that has no basis in reality or basis in science, and you're making it appear as if it does. And you end up with this, right? Disconnected buildings, which gets you right back here, right? So it's the institutionalization of the Corbusian idea of the object in the landscape. And what it keeps you from getting is this. This is open space, but this is owned by everybody. This is not the corner of a parcel, right? This is not, we were discussing interior courtyards. This is the thing that as you walk over the threshold of the street, right, you walk into something that you know is publicly held, not something that you're questioning. Is that mine? Is it Jeff's? Is it Farouk's? Whose is it? Who owns that? And remember, this is the fundamental relationship that all cities were based on up until 100 years ago. And it's not this. And so what we see is a thing called usable open space, which is this. This usable open space was supposed to provide outdoor area for the people that live way back in that tower in the back, right? Talk about an unintended consequence. And this is on a major intersection, which is dead, right? But there are also things that are prohibited that are good. And I'm going to not go through all of them because you can find examples of all of these things through all the codes. But in 1957, right, in most of the cities in the country, street blocks turned into something that were based on use. So the size of blocks were driven by a shopping mall. So imagine if everything in New York, everything in downtown Istanbul had been driven by the use that could not possibly have been known and that would be gone in 15 years, right? So you have these monster super blocks to accommodate traffic and all these sorts of things, right? And when that thing goes out of business, it can't become something else easily in that system. And streets become nothing more than as they still are everywhere in the world, conduit for cars to move through. I mean, this is their primary justification. They're no longer places to exist. And so what happens is, in regeneration, right? This is a neighborhood in 1949. In the interim, the subdivision ordinance was adopted that required blocks to follow their use. And that same area turned into 3 super blocks, which had big residential development, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's crazy when you look at it. So you lose the richness that everybody loves, the thing that everybody voted for, and you get the thing that nobody voted for, all because of the law. And so then with streets, you see that they're nothing. They're vehicular traffic. That's it. They don't even make an attempt to sort of talk about them as anything that has to do with occupational characteristics. And so they're even broken down and categorized so that the boulevard, the avenue, all of these great historic streets are gone and they're simply about capacity. And so this can never exist again because the quality that made this street is again made illegal. And you've seen it. Everybody's driven around the city, you know what I'm talking about. But if you ever don't believe in the power of the law, this one simple sentence that started appearing in subdivision ordinances in the 1950s, one sentence, right? Local streets shall be so laid out so that their use by local traffic shall be discouraged. So if you're a parent, you have children, and you live in a single family neighborhood, and somebody says, you know what, we're going to have no more traffic going through your neighborhood, your reaction is, this is great. Why didn't we do this before, right? But what that means is you have this, which gets you this, which gets you this, right? Which gets you this, which is a completely unsustainable, unconnected, unflexible structure. And it comes from one simple sentence. Right? If you pour through ordinances, it's the required disconnect. And so this is a gigantic, I think, 800-acre area, and there is only one way to move from there across to there, which means everybody that's in this system has to go back out onto this thing, right? To go to the store, to take their kids to school. It puts an undue burden, and it takes away from the opportunity to create any kind of connectivity that exists outside of the automobile. We still do this. And it absolutely gets us further from our stated goal, right? Does this make sense to everybody? I mean, it's maybe, okay. And so if you remember, if you think about what I was talking about in the beginning, the decisions that we make have huge impact on what we do geographically and in time. And so, and this is obviously a sort of metaphor, but when we're doing this, we're getting this, right? We're making it bad for polar bears and our grandchildren. We know we are. But if we do this, we actually end up with happy grandchildren and happy polar bears. So I vote for happy polar bears. And you all are going through a lot of processes right now of trying to figure out how to regenerate, build on green fields. And so it might be of interest to look at all of the mistakes that we made in the United States, that have been made in the UK, that have been transferred throughout the world, and think about how you get back to the fundamental nature of building cities based on dimensional public frameworks. So I'll stop there. Any questions? Yes?
How is it possible, for example, for Istanbul, for this grids and
You already have it. You have it right here, right?
but just it is very small area,
So this is an interesting issue. So why? You have two things you have to fight, right? You have, I'm going to use them as the bad guys, transportation planners, right? Who are all driven by transportation demand on a project. And so they start building large arterials that are connected to highways, et cetera, et cetera. And they believe there's a science behind that. You have to be able to demonstrate that you have there's a much greater capacity here, actually, right, for vehicular traffic than there is with the hierarchical system. That's one thing, which is the science of the thing. And that extends to parking, setbacks, open space, everything. The second part to this is getting the developers to understand, right? So I worked for developers for 20 years, so I was on the other side. And all they care about is that this thing will allow them to build what they want to build. So if you understand the dimensions and the characteristics of building for developers, you can set the blocks up so that they're just big enough to get the development projects, but not too big so that they become unwalkable. And it's a beautiful kind of dimension. In the United States, 240 by 360, 240 feet by 360 feet, right? And you don't have to take that for truth, but you have to understand it to that level, right? So as an urban designer, you have to understand the nature of how you do traffic demand so you can fight that side, and you have to understand the nature of the building so that you can understand that. It's not just about putting lines on the ground, right, and hoping that they get built that way. It's a struggle, and it goes back to what you were saying. It's an educational process, right? Well, you mean we can have less congestion if we do this? We can make more. We can have a higher return on our investment if we do this. Absolutely, right? That makes sense.
yeah.
Sort of. Yes.
I think it was fascinating to see how the laws and restrictions are putting an impact on the environment and what it can turn into inhumane.
Yeah.
What would be your advice for like lawmakers, like the decision makers, in that sense, like what kind of principles can they adopt?
That's a great question. So what kind of principles? So people in the world are generally not very smart. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that it's hard for us to keep more than like 3 or 4 things in our mind, right? So if you go back to the slide that talks about what kind of city do you want, right? You think about the 2 or 3 characteristics that you really want to see happen, and you describe those with precision, right? You absolutely make people do those things. And then you let the other stuff just sort of emerge as it emerges, right? But if you're trying to get people to understand 80 different things, it's impossible to get to the core. So in most jurisdictions, and this is a strange thing, people think that historic-looking buildings are what make great cities. And so you can take streets and trade them in the negotiation process for more brick on buildings, right? Because it looks old. And so what that's doing is it's setting up a system where streets have the same value as brick on a building, right? Which is crazy because streets last forever. And the brick on a building can get replaced in 10 years. So you have to find those 2 or 3 things and just focus on that. Does that make sense? It's hard for us to understand because what we go through is so complex, right? We have all of these different issues that we're dealing with. But think how hard it is for people that don't do this for a living, right? The general public, right? What do you like? What do you want to see? And then figure out how to put that in place. But you have to have the answers, right? You can't just wish it to happen. So, that doesn't tell you exactly what to do. Any other questions? Sorry. No? All right.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.